Tonight we have a special presentation from Merritt Long, who will read excerpts from his book, My View from the Back of the Bus. Merritt Long will share stories of growing up in the South during the Jim Crow era and how his childhood, segregation, and the civil rights movement shaped his life. After attending Morehouse College in Atlanta, he moved to Seattle, where he began his 37-year career with the state of Washington, serving as executive director of chair of four agencies: Washington State Liquor Control Board, Washington State Lottery, Washington State Human Rights Commission, and the Washington State Board for Vocational Education. Quite a career. He has also served on numerous community boards and is a mentor to today's youth. Mr. Long and his wife, Marcia, started the Learning Seed Foundation in 2001, which has awarded close to $500,000 in new and renewable scholarships to 109 students from Thurston and Pierce counties. We are also delighted to have Gloria Colvin Jackson, who earlier presented to the enlightened community on the Great Migration and the Black history, and the history of the Black settlement in Bremerton. Ms. Jackson will interview her longtime friend of over 50 years. Mr. Long will read a segment from his book, and Ms. Jackson will ask several questions. After that, you will have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat room. At the end of the program, we will allot some overtime to answer additional questions. So now, please welcome Merritt Long and Gloria Colvin Jackson.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Gloria, how do you want to start?
I have script here. Mary, you can tell us a little bit about how it became that you wrote this book.
Right, okay. Thank you, Gloria. It's really very serendipitous how the book came about. 15 plus years ago, I was invited to speak at the Washington State Liquor Control Board during Black History Month. At this particular time, I was a member of the Locke administration as the lottery director. And I'd made other presentations during Black History Month over the years. And typically I've identified some historic, iconic African-American figure, whether that be Dr. Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or George Bush, one of the founders here in Olympia. But for some reason, Gloria, I couldn't get the notion out of my head of what I could possibly mine from writing about my first bus ride, because I was a part of history. I didn't need any annotations, or I didn't need to go to the library to look it up, because the experience that I had growing up in the South during this era helped fashion and shape who I am. So I thought that would be of value to share with the liquor board staff, which had a range of individuals in terms of age and background. So that's how it came about initially. And then from that, the response that I received after reading the vignette was such that I thought I could possibly write other vignettes about my life growing up in the segregated South and moving to the Northwest, experiencing things change, but sometimes they remain the same. And I thought this would be something positive to do as an homage to my mother and father and the sacrifices that they had made for my brother and I to go to college. And then secondly, it would be something that our daughter, Marisa, could take advantage of, because my experience was something for her would be from TV clips or from reading articles. And the more I thought about it, it's not just my story. This is an American story. My last comment on this, I received a call from an email from a gentleman in Tacoma, Jim Walton, first African-American city manager for the city of Tacoma. And after Jim finished the book, he said, Merritt, I was on that same bus that you were on. So that's the background and some of the detail around how the book came about. And
So Merritt, you wrote this. Oh, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
You wrote this through the lens of a 5-year-old boy. You're excited about your first bus trip.
Right.
You're all dressed up.
Right.
You're with your mother and your brother. You're an innocent child,
Right.
totally unaware of the laws that restrict you from standing in the front of the bus.
Right.
As you reflect on that experience now, many years later, what thoughts come to mind?
Okay. Well, Gloria, I tell you what I'm going to do for everyone's benefit is to reflect on that bus ride, and then from there walk through your question in the sense of the impact of that ride and reflecting on that from today's lens as well as other lenses that I've looked at it in the past. So I'll do that, and I think that'll help shape the and fashion the right tone. And this is from my book, My View from the Back of the Bus. Okay, I'm just gonna take a deep breath here and just kind of exhale. And if you guys can kind of do the same and stretch out a little bit, relax, and seeking you, I want you to go back in time with me now. We're gonna travel back to a little town called Bessemer, Alabama. I think at that time there was about 50,000 people. You had the red clay, and we used to eat the red clay. And later in life, I realized, and after learning that there was zinc from the ore mines that was in the red clay, and there was all kind of mother's tales and father's tales of the value, health of the red dirt. My father used to plant peanuts. Anyway, I'm just trying to give you a little flavor of this of the South and the time that I grew up. But now let's get on that bus. I was 5 years old and minutes away from my first bus ride to the city of Birmingham, Alabama. That was something special in the air that crisp morning as my mother, brother, Kenneth, and I walked a few blocks from our house to the bus stop. I remember walking carefully to avoid getting scuff marks on my new Buster Brown shoes. The puddles of rainwater from last night's showers weren't to be sought out as in the past. This special Saturday, my mom had combed and brushed my hair and parted it on the left side. Several weeks before, she had purchased identical brown suits with a nice jacket and short pants for my brother and me. We waited at the bus stop on Clarendon Avenue that special Saturday for about 10 minutes before I spotted the large gray bus with red trim barreling toward us. Its squeaky brakes slammed the vehicle to a screeching halt, as if the driver had considered passing us by. The white bus driver opened the door. We climbed the 3 steps to where the bus driver sat stiff in his seat, not bothering to nod or smile hello. My mother deposited 3 quarters for our bus fare. The bus driver simply shut the door behind us and started driving down the avenue. Who cared about the silent bus driver? Not me, because I was taking my first bus ride to that faraway land of Birmingham. I felt 10 feet tall. I started moving forward toward a vacant seat, but I immediately felt my mom tense up. She quickly grabbed my brother and me by the hand, leading us to the back of the bus. I glanced around wondering what was wrong with the row of seats I initially considered. Were they broken? Were they dirty? What was wrong with those seats in the front of the bus? No one was sitting there. They seemed okay to me. As we moved to the back of the bus, I saw a sign separating one section of the seats from the other. The wooden sign we passed as we headed to the back of the bus said colored. It looked like the word colored had been burned into the wood with tinges and specks of black and brown. After sitting down, I noticed all of the white people on the bus sat toward the front, and the colored sign was behind them. As the bus traveled away from my neighborhood, more and more white passengers got on. So many white people boarded the bus, the driver pulled over and stopped. He got up from his seat, removed the wooden colored sign, and placed it several rows further to the back of the bus, allowing white riders to sit, but forcing black riders to stand. Once the sign was moved, if seats became available in the front of the bus, they remained vacant because black folks were required to stay put behind the colored sign. How strange, I thought. Even when there were vacant seats in the front and all the seats behind the colored sign were full, black people still had to stay behind the sign and stand. My 5-year-old eyes noticed an elderly black man who looked frail and not in the best of health. As he stood and held on to the overhead bar for support, he swayed back and forth until it seemed he would fall. Then he would catch himself. My gaze would follow him each time he swayed, only to stop just before he fell, as though I had some magical powers that could protect him from falling. For no apparent reason, the bus driver started driving really fast, like he decided to have some cruel and unusual fun, intentionally hitting bumps so the black riders would bounce around like bowling balls. For a split second, the back of the bus became heavy with despair and hopelessness, which was apparent by the number of downcast eyes. Suddenly, the frail, elderly black man yelled out with a voice of authority, "Do not pay us no never mind. Don't worry about going fast. There's no one back here. There's no one back here." The bus went silent. We were all suspended in time. The frail, elderly truth teller had expressed the indignity of the moment. My self-respect returned, and judging by the faces of every black person on the bus, so had theirs. It didn't matter that we sat in the back of the bus. Surprisingly, after the elderly gentleman called out to the bus driver, he slowed down. For the remaining trip, the bus with its black and white passengers stayed quiet. The silence rang out loud and true. When we arrived in Birmingham, the whites exited the bus through the front door and blacks exited through the back door. Two races from the same town lived and moved in and out of the city through different doors with different windows. We lived two different lives, one white, one colored, the back of the bus.
Thank you, Merritt. You know, as you were reading that excerpt, I was right there on the bus with you too. That's what it felt like.
Good.
Do we
Good.
have any comments, questions from the audience at this time? No?
While folks are probing and thinking and writing maybe their question down, let me just share something, Gloria, back to the question that you had asked me in terms of the influence of this experience.
Yeah.
For me, as a 5-year-old, it was the first time I had witnessed a person, an African American person, speak to a white person in power with his, in this particular case, a man, his truth about the situation. Now, what do I mean? The elderly gentleman couldn't change the situation. This was the law of the land, but he could make his point of view known and express the indignity of the moment to let the driver know that how he and others were being treated on the bus was not right. So that was something that I think a seed was planted with me that day. And over the years, as I have grown and met people from all over the US of A and abroad, and teachers and friends and counselors and you name it, the person at the gas station who might be helpful to me, whatever the situation might be, of the ability to speak up and speak out when things are definitely not right. So that was and then the second part of that is the person that I thought was a frail elderly gentleman was a lion in sheep's clothing. He was the lion. And I thought the gentleman could hardly stand up on the bus. And he stood up, not just for himself, but for all of us.
So
Questions?
true.
Yes, there's a question here. One thing was, how did your mom explain what had happened to you and to the whole bus when you got off the bus?
Well, Jill, that is a really good question, because first of all, that's the first time I've gotten that question. Thank you. And secondly, I don't remember us having a discussion about that incident. I just remember coming away from that knowing what the rules of the game were if you were riding on the bus as an African American, Black, colored, whatever the descriptor you might want to use. And that was the extent of it. So I don't recall. I'll think some more on it, and if I recall, I'd like to pull something up if something is there, but I don't remember that happening. At the same time, just to give you another example, which is also in the book, the nights that the Ku Klux Klan came by our home in Bessemer on the avenue, about a dozen cars with the lights on the inside and the horns blaring, and how we dealt with that. And once the Klan left, no discussion. I mean, everybody knew what time it was, and we had a sense of why we thought the Klan had come by, but we did not discuss it.
Mhm.
There's two more questions here now. The first one is, what do you think made this gentleman speak up, speak to power, more or less?
That's a really good question. And several days ago, I had the thought, Jill, about possibly writing a follow-up book focused around the elderly Black man, who obviously I didn't, I don't have a picture of him. I don't know what his face looks like. I just have an image in my head. But I thought that could be something to really get into in terms of creating creative fiction about him. And as a part of that process, his background and his circumstance, what had happened to him as a young child. I'm just torn with the idea. But only thing I can think about was him maybe being in a situation where maybe he didn't speak up. Maybe something happened early in life and he regretted it. And he said, it's not going to happen again.
Thank you. And then there's one last question. Did ever they put the back of the colored sign back forward again? Like you said, they were getting more and more Black people in the back of the bus. And as the whites maybe came less, did they ever allow more space again?
Well, typically that would occur when, say, the bus has run its course of pickups and delivery, and the bus is pretty much empty. Uh, because the further you went north, the more passengers came on, but in coming back the other way, you didn't have as many passengers going south. So I believe the sign would be moved more back, not to the middle, but 3/4 of the way to the back. So yes, it was moved.
Oh, there's just one final one, and then we'll probably go on to the next segment. But it's, how did the silence from everyone in the bus make you feel?
It made me feel good because I felt the silence reflected the fact that with the voice of the elderly gentleman, he had given us all voice, and the silence told me people were absorbing and listening and reflecting on his powerful message. So it made me feel good, made me feel proud.
Thank you, and continue with your program.
Okay. So
So
Gloria,
Merritt, next you're going to talk to us about.
okay. Okay, I'll move on to the next vignette. It's a touching moment between parents, and the many sides of my father. My father, before just a couple things, my father never knew his father. The only thing he remembers about his father was that as a young kid, 3 years, or maybe 4 or 5 years old, he remembers sitting on a horse next to a white man. And my father's mother, who we just found out her name here in the last 2 years, worked on this farm for this white gentleman, and she had at least 6, 7 babies for him, by him, with him. LaTanya looked it up on the what was that, March? 1910 census, and we saw it, and we have a copy of it where the list shows my father and who his father was and the mother and her background. So I never, ever heard my father discuss his mom or dad or his childhood ever. So it was always a mystery and something that when my father's brothers and sisters would get together, they would get together and talk to one another, but they never shared any of those discussions with any other family members about their childhood and how they grew up, etc. But I'm going to pick up on the day when my father came home from work unexpectedly or early. The sound of my father's voice was troubling that day when he came home from work about 2 p.m. He walked into the kitchen through the back door, and as soon as he saw my mother's face, he said the following words that I'd never heard him say before or again. Kate, I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't immediately know what that meant other than it wasn't something good. Our father had been working construction on a major housing project about a half mile from our home. This type of temporary construction job was the kind of job he was able to obtain after he'd been laid off from his permanent job at the Pullman Standard plant of Bessemer, a company that made train boxcars. I was in the doorway of the kitchen when my father walked by, and I noticed his shirt wasn't tucked in his pants. Although he wore what he referred to as muckers, work clothes accustomed to being in the muck, mire, and dirt, he still tucked his work shirt into his pants. Even in muckers, my father took pride in his appearance. My mother was home preparing dinner when he unexpectedly arrived home several hours earlier than usual. As she turned around to greet my father, she saw something was wrong. Her expressive eyes looked pained and worried. I could see her asking herself before she asked him what might be wrong. Finally, she spoke. Matt, what happened? I felt uncomfortable being in the kitchen during this conversation and quietly left the area. I sat down in the living room, still close by. Our house was so small, which meant everything and everybody was nearby. It was about 1,000 square feet with 2 bedrooms, dining room, living room, kitchen, bathroom, and a screen side porch. My father told my mother that he'd been digging a ditch for over an hour, and it seemed no matter how he dug the ditch, the white supervisor wasn't satisfied. My father was an extremely hardworking man, and he took pride in his work, regardless of the job. After a certain point, he said the supervisor started calling him names and screaming at him for no apparent reason. That August summer day was one of those that was so hot, mothers kept their kids indoors to shield them from the scorching sun. Even the strength and durability of iron, if hammered on enough, will wear out, my mother used to say. She felt our father, her husband, had reached the point where iron wears out. He saw two choices. One, to knock the out of that name calling Peckerwood, or two, quit the job. He decided to quit and come home. I've never known my father to quit anything he tried, especially a job. His creed was if you wanted to work, you could always find a job. It may not be the job you wanted, but if you wanted to work, you can always find a job. This wasn't something he just talked about. He lived this philosophy throughout his life. In the ring of work, he never been knocked out and had to walk away from a job. He wasn't wired that way. Supporting his family was his paramount duty. So for him to quit a job, even under horrible circumstances, was an unspeakable act. However, his dignity had been breached. He couldn't go any further. Now he stood in his home apologizing to his wife because he felt he'd let her down. I rarely, if ever, observed moments of tenderness or physical affection between parents, but the painfully humiliating experience for my father ironically led to a touching and loving moment. As I peeked around the corner, my mother was hugging my father as tears rolled down his cheek. She comforted him by slowly and softly saying over and over, "It's okay, Matt. It's okay, Matt. It's going to be okay." I went outside in the stifling heat, knowing everything was okay. And for me, in some ways, better than ever. I was so proud and happy for my mother and father during this real life tragedy. My mother and father showed true care and affection for one another at an intense level when everything seemed so bleak. It made me feel good. How ironic and tragic that a man felt down because he walked away from a job as a result of verbal abuse. Even though my father was digging a trench for a construction job, he still retained his pride and sense of self. Tragic, because in addition to quitting, a word not as my father's vocabulary, he experienced the pain of letting his family, especially his wife. Fortunately, my father's self-worth and sense of dignity won over personal verbal abuse at any price. If he had stayed, I think he would have left part of himself in that 3-foot trench forever. I remember seeing Black men similar to my father in age, education, and work experience, and some appeared to have left their pride and self-respect in a ditch, trench, or the back of a garbage truck, never to be seen or heard from again. Sometimes the price of doing the right economic thing pales in comparison to the long-term psychological harm that that scars one forever. The many
Interesting.
sides of Mac Law.
You know, you recalling this incident, it's very sad and touching. But sad because your father was treated in such a demeaning way on his job and he had to quit or lose his dignity as a human being.
Right.
But touching because of the love and support your mother showed towards him, which in those days, parents, grandparents, they rarely showed affection
Right.
towards each other, and yet they did love each other. Tell us a little bit. Did you think of your parents differently after you observed the exchange?
Well, my first response in thinking about, and my first thought in thinking about the question is, yes, that did change, but really, I saw another facet, another element of their relationship that I hadn't seen before. I'm sure probably just the two of them, they had their moments, but I was just privy to that situation. I'm not saying there were a number of them, and I know that's not the case. And then in terms of hugging me or my brother, my mother would show her affection with food and how she cooked. And my father, I guess his love was working in tolerable situations and making money to support the family. But I know when we had our daughter Marisa, man, that poor child, Marsha and I must have hugged her to death. She see us coming because Marsha's similar family in terms of growing up. That was just the way it was, and not was, but that's the way parents and grandparents, particularly your immediate parents, treated you. Now, when your grandmother, come on, baby, give me some of that sugar. So,
You weren't getting away from that, were you?
no.
Gee, at this time I have to ask, are there any comments or questions from our audience about what Merritt just told us about? And while they're getting their thoughts together, Merritt, can you just expound a little bit on your relationship with your dad as that young man?
When I went off to college, I didn't hate my father, but if my mother had said I hate him, if she had said, he's a bad man, as opposed to her saying, your father is doing the best he can. And then when my brother and I would do something untoward, very untoward, she would say, your father doesn't know any better. But you guys have, you've had more experiences and education than he's ever had. So you should know better. And then, Gloria, seemingly when I started working and as a young adult, then our relationship changed. And also he stopped drinking as much and pretty much stopped drinking altogether because often his temper was fueled by alcohol. That we had fun. We had a lot of fun together. I mean, I'll just give you this one example. He was word had it was that he would not walk, but he would ride the bus to Birmingham, and he would stand on the bus because he didn't want to get his trousers wrinkled. So he'd stand, okay? So Dapper Dan, we're going to church, and one of the things in the South, especially, you're not working in the downtown office, you're not at IBM, you're not at Safeway, you're not wearing shirt and ties. The church is a place where Black folks rest and dress and put the hats and the suits and pocket watches and go for it and lay it out. So my father asked me, because I was going to church with him that day, and he said, well, what are you wearing today? I said, well, I think I'm gonna wear this plaid brownish suit, different little checks and stuff in it. And no, I wore a solid brown suit, and he wore the plaid jacket, suit, the whole 9 yards. I looked like the father, he looked like the dad. And what he had done was use my solid brown suit as a backdrop for his suit. It toned his suit down and made him look really good. So I said, man, why don't you tell me I was going to be your backdrop today? So we used to have those kinds of conversations, which was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Perhaps Jill, did we get any questions or comments from the audience?
So one came in way at the late, if you want. That was a very moving story. What about the work history of your father? Was there after that incident? Did he get another job?
Yes, he did. My father, with all due respect to taxi drivers, Lyft drivers, Uber drivers, bus drivers, he used to call taxi drivers the laziest people in the world. Why? Because they sit down all day. So his idea of work is physicality, doing something, tearing something up, building something. So he would be one of those guys, when he didn't have his regular job, would stand on the corner to be picked up to go to work and just get a job for that particular day. So he would always find short-term employment to offset his being laid off. Sometimes it took longer than others, which meant there were periods where we didn't have very much to eat, and it was a little difficult at times.
Thank you.
But he always eventually got a job.
Thank you. There are no more.
Is that it,
Okay.
Jill?
Yes, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Merritt, talk to us about when you met. Talk to us
Jam.
about when you met Muhammad Ali.
Okay, that'll be a real
Yeah.
pleasure. That was meeting the Muhammad Ali was a real highlight of the time I spent in Atlanta, Georgia. And as you may all recall, during the 66, 67, 68, the Vietnam War, the champ had been stripped of his heavyweight title because of his failure to adhere to being drafted. He felt as though he was a conscientious objector. And anyway, he was a person who at one point was considered a coward, a traitor, Black Muslim. I mean, Ali in his later life became revered, but let's be clear about it. That's not the way he was always viewed. When I saw him, it was like in a transition period. He was lecturing on college campuses around the country to earn income to support his family because he couldn't box. His livelihood had been taken away for 4 years. So what I'm going to do is to share with you a portion of the vignette that I was fortunate enough to write about Muhammad Ali. In 1967, when I was a junior at Morehouse College, I was leaving the campus of our sister school, Spelman College, when I noticed an immaculate white four-door Cadillac making a left turn to enter Spelman College campus. Seldom would you see a car entering the campus during the day. Usually it was in the evening when those Morehouse students fortunate enough to have a car would arrive at Spelman's campus to pick up their dates, especially on Friday and Saturday nights. The Cadillac screeched to a halt, and the black tinted window on the back seat passenger side rolled down. To my surprise, Muhammad Ali poked his head out of the window and asked, "Do you know where Spelman College is at?" My initial thought took me back to my 9th grade English teacher, Mrs. Daisy Pearl Chapman, who would have responded to the champ by saying, "You never end a sentence with the preposition at." I quickly realized my responsibility wasn't to correct Muhammad's English, but to give him directions as requested. Once I came back to my senses, I let the champ know he was headed in the right direction and that he should keep going and he would reach the heart of the campus. Keep going. You can't miss it. I thought, sorry, Mrs. Chapman, English lesson would have to be given another time to the champ. One of the advantages of attending one of the colleges in the Atlanta University Center, comprised of Clark, Spelman, Morris Brown, and Morehouse, was that you could attend classes at any of the participating schools to meet your graduation requirements. During my 4 years at Morehouse, I took classes at Clark College as well as Spelman College. In addition to having the opportunity to meet students from different schools access-wise, it was a piece of cake because Clark and Spelman were stone throws away. The day after I gave directions to Muhammad Ali at Spelman College, he walked into my religion and philosophy class led by Dr. Rogers at Clark College. Suddenly, we had a visiting professor. Ali just took over the class by simply walking into the room. He greeted our instructor, shook his hand, and Dr. Rogers, right on cue, moved from the front of the classroom to the side of the room. He instantly knew it was a champ's class now. Muhammad Ali proceeded to give the class a lecture about the negative connotations associated with the word Black and the positive attributes associated with the word white. His observation included the following: white hat, good guy; black hat, bad guy; angel food cake, white; devil food's cake, black; black male, bad; bad hair, nappy, curly hair; white lie, good; black magic, evil; black cat, bad luck; white angels, good; good hair, straight hair. This impromptu lecture provided by the former heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali, focused on how he felt some white people tried to consciously and subconsciously influence the thinking and self-concept of Black people and the perception of Black people by associating negativity and in some cases evil with the word Black. I don't recall very many questions being asked of the champ. Like me, most of the students had never heard the perspective that Ali shared that spring day. It was as if he was going behind the meaning of the word Black and how one's psyche is influenced by something that on its surface may appear harmless. Portion of a vignette regarding Muhammad Ali. Questions?
Merritt,
Yes.
you speak highly of Muhammad Ali. I remember those times very well where I hate is a strong word, but he was very well shunned because he did not accept the draft.
Right.
I also remember a few years later in the early 70s when one man spoke up on his behalf and it turned the attitude in that sports arena around him. And that man was Howard Cosell.
Right.
And I have never forgotten Howard stood up for him. And that was a good thing. And he would then go on and have some really great boxing matches.
Right, right. I mean, he and Howard became like a tag
prior
team.
to him coming into the classroom.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah, they goofed off a lot. They admired each other. They loved each other.
Oh yeah. I remember one
prior
instance,
to him being in the classroom.
Well, I just, you made me think about Howard Cosell, and this is when Muhammad had started boxing again, and he had won more than he'd lost, but he'd lost some of his speed and was getting hit more often. And so Howard Cosell, Muhammad, you're not the man you used to be, Muhammad. And then Muhammad said, Howard, what are you talking about? He said, I talked to your wife, and she said, you're not the man you used to be. So, I mean, they would just go at it, okay, in a loving, playful way.
Do we have any questions at this time for audience?
I think Morehouse is what they call a historically Black
That's
college.
correct. Mhm.
But the question is, at the time that you attended, were there any white students, or what was the racial mixture of Spelman and Morehouse, for example?
Okay. Good question. Morehouse was, when I was there, 64 to 68, that was probably a little over 1,000, 1,500, maybe 1,200 students at the most. Now I think there's like 2,000 plus, still a small school, all male primarily. We get students who come to class from Spelman, which is our sister school, all female. But to your question in terms of white, at Morehouse, we're talking 99% Black. I was there, I'm trying to think, not 68, maybe 66. And the valedictorian for Morehouse College was a white dude. And he'd been there 4 years, and his brother was coming to Morehouse that coming fall. And Morehouse and Spelman both would have transfer students or students coming in from, say, Wesleyan or some other school where you had white students coming in from other schools to attend Morehouse for a year and attend Spelman for a year. But basically, it was 99% African-American at both institutions. The numbers have increased, but not appreciably to my knowledge.
And Merritt, excuse me, Jill, you and I talked about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the past. Explain to this audience what that means and why we have that so many of them, and
Okay.
in reference to today, if you will, of why. You go ahead.
Sure. Well, let me just do a little plug here first for Howard and for Spelman and for Morehouse, particularly with this most recent election, because the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is a undergrad graduate of Howard University. And then Stacey Abrams, and we know the work that she's done with the past election and almost being governor, is a Spelman graduate. And then the most recent election of Reverend Warnock of Georgia, he and the other gentleman that won helped turn the Senate around, is also a Morehouse College graduate. And he preaches at the church where the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King used to preach, and is probably the most famous alum of Morehouse College. I can't ignore Spike Lee and Samuel Jackson, who are also Morehouse alums. And then you have the other rung of the stream, and that would be Merritt Long is a Morehouse grad. But, anyway, back to HBCUs. Essentially, HBCUs came out of the necessity of white institutions not admitting or allowing Black students to attend college, whether that's George Wallace at University of Alabama Door, or whether some other liberal institution in the East or South or Midwest, which started the HBCU process. And I know I'm going to ask Marcia, because she probably has the exact numbers of the HBCUs at one point and where they are now in terms of numbers. Marcia, give me your best guess. Yeah, I will. Okay. Marcia said, according to the research she did a while back, at one point there were 39 HBCUs, and now there are 31. And the gentleman that that is responsible for raising money for the United Negro College Fund, which provides funds to the HCBUs, is a gentleman by the name of Michael Lomax, who also was a classmate of mine at Morehouse. And Dr. Lomax has done a fantastic job at the HBCU fundraising efforts over the last decade. So it came out of necessity.
It certainly did. And I think it was 1962 when James Merritt attempted to integrate Ole Miss and was met at the door of the university by the governor, but he did persist, and he was able to get admitted. And I tell this story to a lot of young, especially my relatives who live in Alabama and Georgia and Virginia, and they run around talking about Roll Tide and this and that, and I still have to remind them that their presence was not always welcome at Alabama.
Right.
They find that surprising, but they feel like they're so far removed from it that it doesn't make a lot of difference anymore. And that's just what it is today.
Yeah.
But that's where our NFL teams came in, recruiting football players. We used to have football players from Grounding. Mississippi Valley State is where Jerry Rice came from.
Right.
But when the university started recruiting these football players, that changed the whole game of the HBCUs and their funding, because they were taking the cream of the crop and allowing them to be admitted.
You're
and we're
absolutely
talking about not long ago.
No, not at all. And you're absolutely correct. One of the articles, paragraphs that I read quite some time ago was when Sam the Bam Cunningham played for USC, and USC, University of Southern Cal, went to Alabama and played the University of Alabama, and Cunningham just wore them out, Alabama, that day. And legend has it that Sam Cunningham, by his performance against the all-white Alabama team, did more to cause integration than any other person that had been in the South, because the Bear knew he needed other players to be able to compete as the competition was getting greater. Because you look at the salaries, Gloria, say Nick, as Mr. Saban, he's making probably $7 million or something, a minimum a year. Some of the defensive positions coordinators are making $2 million. And then here are the students athletes who the associations don't want to pay them anything because they're quote unquote student athletes. It's a very, in my mind, institution. Is like and most of the players are Black, most of the owners are white. The people who have benefited from the game financially the most are white people, who percentage on the field is probably less than 25% or no more than 25%. So, and I know there's, you've probably been hearing about John Gruden. I don't want to get far afield, but that's an area that we're going to be hearing more about in the next several months because of some things that happened recently. But it's a very imperfect system that, for me, prays and takes advantage of talented Black kids. Now, you can make the argument they're getting an education for free, but what happens when they get hurt? What happens when they don't finish school and they're on to another student coming in and like nothing happened? So I'll stop there. I don't want to get too wound up on this.
We want to get back to the book. Jill, do you happen to have any questions from our audience?
There was one more from the audience, and it was asking, who are others of your role models?
Well, most definitely my my mother and my father, my wife, Marcia. Without Marcia, we wouldn't be having this conversation today, not only from the technical side, but the book side, because she was very instrumental in getting me across the finish line and continues to do marvelous stuff. Our daughter. And then there are two individuals in particular I referenced in the book. And one is a classmate of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Samuel B. McKinney out of Seattle, who took me under his wings when I first moved here in 1968. And he was very involved, not only from a ministry, but also from a political point of view. And he was very helpful to me as a someone who knew how to work the political side of things from a community point of view and rallying people behind what you're trying to do. And then the other person that I mentioned in the book is a guy by the name of Jim Williams. And Jim was the first African-American person that I knew who headed up a major multi-million-dollar organization. So I really benefited from being really at his knee, and Henry Beauchamp in Yakima and other OIC directors, but particularly Jim and Reverend McKinney were very helpful in not the so much managing an organization, but the politics and the external factors that impact an organization, and how do you use that to your benefit.
Thank you. Perhaps go back to the go back to your readings again. They're so interesting.
Okay, I'll do it. Okay, this is a reading I'm going to do from my time when I was my first director position as the head of the state board of the commission for voc ed. And I'm going to read some things from that I think you will find interesting. Being appointed the executive director didn't always mean being recognized as such. In 1988, Scott Rob Fieldman, a vocational education program specialist at the Commission for Voc Ed, suggested that we travel to Tacoma, Washington, about 30 minutes north of Olympia, to meet with the president of Western Washington University. The commission, our office, had just awarded the university $500,000 to develop and provide statewide teacher training for existing and new teachers. This curriculum model and teaching philosophy will be based on the projected demographic changes that would occur in the year 2000 and beyond. The forecast was that school districts across the state would become increasingly diverse with unique challenges and opportunities. Rob suggested we set up a photo opportunity with the Western Washington president. Normally, we would have had to travel to Western Washington University campus in Bellingham, Washington, about 150 miles away. However, since the president would be in Tacoma on other business, Rob thought we should take advantage of his proximity and take a photo of the two leaders for an article in our agency newsletter. Excellent idea, I thought. Let's do it. The meeting and photo shoot was scheduled for the next day. Rob and I arrived at the Tacoma Sheraton Hotel at the appointed time. We had agreed to meet the president in the lobby of the hotel. Rob and I stood side by side as we stepped onto the escalator and made our way up to the lobby. We immediately spotted the president at the top of the stairs, awaiting our arrival. I noticed he had zeroed in on Rob and had started to smile at him. Not once did he look in my direction. It was as if I wasn't even there, totally invisible. Suddenly, I saw and felt Rob's body language shift. Like me, he knew what was about to happen, and there was no way to stop it. As we both stepped up the escalator, the Western Washington University president, with two, not one, but two outstretched arms, reached out to Rob. "Mr. Long, what a pleasure it is to meet you." Rob quickly pivoted to me. "No, I'm not Mr. Long. Here is Mr. Long." Awkward and telling. The president momentarily just stood there, speechless, frozen in time, with a stunned look on his face. Judging from his facial expression, he looked like a man struggling to wake up from a bad dream. Surely this wasn't happening to him, the president of one of the state's most progressive higher ed institutions, an institution that had recently won a statewide competitive bid, winning out over some of the state's longer standing universities. My thoughts and emotions range from surprise, embarrassment for Rob being caught in the middle of the awkward situation, ironically because he was white, and finally the realization on my part of what's new. At the same time, I was glad for Rob to have this experience so he would know how these things do occur, and he had an opportunity, I'm sure, unfortunately, experience it firsthand. This was not the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time, when a white person would make assumptions about my place, where I should fit or not fit, or ignore me altogether because of my skin color. Portion of a vignette, Commission for Vocational Education. Questions, comments?
I'm trying to imagine you riding up to Tacoma to have this very important meeting with college president to meet and talk about an education grant. You get to the motel, you ride up the escalator, and that moment that you realize that the college president was zooming on Rob,
Right.
thinking he was Mr. Long. How did that at the moment, how did that make you feel? Were you shocked, surprised, angry?
It was one of those situations, and this has happened to me before, where you're in the middle of your work. You're doing what you do, whether that's in the boardroom, whether that's giving testimony to the legislature, whether that's working or meeting with a constituent who has some issues, or whatever the situation might be as you carry out your job. And me, in carrying out my job in whatever capacity, I'm not carrying out that job thinking, "Oh, I'm here as a Black guy doing this job." I am Merritt at work doing what I do. So I've been woken up because I'm so into what I'm doing. I'm not relating or thinking, here's a white guy I'm going to meet with versus him and how he's looking at me and seeing me. It's a total deal sometimes of the person that I'm meeting with, trying to get comfortable. Then, especially because it was much longer ago than now, I would hope that wouldn't be the case. So after I sort of snapped out of it, in the sense of, not that I was asleep, but it just was out of left field for that to be happening. And also, Gloria, this was a historic moment. This agency in its history has never given out that kind of money to one entity before. That philosophy had been give everybody a little something, make everybody happy, versus setting some priorities and making some decisions on how we can invest this money and get the best return on it. So fortunately, the chairman of the board at the time was a guy by the name of Dick Thompson, who was the governor's chief of staff. And Dick thought the idea of doing what we were doing and proposing was a good idea, because I'm sure if it had just been me pushing it, it wouldn't have happened, because the powers to be would have negated. But because of the weight of the governor in the governor's office, we were able to get this historic amount of money for a singular purpose. So it's so ironic that, and then, I mean, here's my word, here's $500,000 I've been sweating over for 2 years to get to this day. and the dude doesn't even recognize the person who's really behind the whole deal. And then I thought, welcome to America. That's the way it happened. So I just went along with what we had to do that day, and took the pictures, had a great shot in the newsletter. And Rob and I, that was probably the best part, in the sense of him having that experience with me and being able to share that within the organization and use it as a teaching moment. So it was a range of emotions that day, Gloria, that occurred, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time.
So can you just give us a little insight? Because most of us have experienced or witnessed these instances of stereotyping, sexism, racism, whatever it might be. In your opinion, since you're now the expert, what might be some ways for us to respond in these situations?
Okay. Let me just share a couple of things. One is, I remember when I first started working in Olympia in the vocational education arena, the gentleman that hired me, great guy, smart guy, he hired me, right? Okay. Anyway, so I'm meeting with him. He's white. And he said, Merritt, do you know Jimmy Holyfield, as an example? And I said, no, not really. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I think I know why he's asking me that. And then maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, he and I are meeting again, and he asked me another obscure name of someone and whether or not I knew this person. And I said, no, don't know him. So the third time he and I met, I reversed the roles on him, and Gloria, I said, do you know John Davidson, or do you know this guy? And he went, no. I said, well, he's white. I mean, don't you know all white people like you think I know all Black people? So a little humor, but getting the message across. He never asked me that question that way again. If he wanted to ask me about someone that was Black, he just asked, as opposed to going through this little game that we were playing. So I think sometimes when you message something that way, the receiver will get it and respond to it, maybe not. And then I think the other part of it is, I had a meeting with Sam Smith here years ago when he was on the Seattle City Council, and he was very much involved in, of course, the business of the city, but he had a strong interest in correctional reform and correctional programming jobs. And I had some work in that arena that I was doing. And I was fortunate enough to be meeting with the city councilman, Councilman Smith. And when I came to see him, he wasn't feeling very well that day. He just looked not quite the same. And I asked him what was wrong. And he said, well, Merritt, he said, there's nothing worse than a silent friend. And he meant someone who stands by, sees something going wrong, sees something being said that shouldn't be said. Maybe he or she wants something from that same group, and he or she doesn't want to jeopardize what they want, and refuse to speak up and speak out on what's being said. So I think as the elderly gentleman, the lion, the sheep in lion's clothes spoke, he couldn't change the situation, but at least he could speak to the indignity of the moment. So those are some things that come to mind right away, and I'm sure others will come here in a few
That's
seconds.
good advice, Merritt. That's, for all of us that run into these experiences. Well, I wanted to ask Jill if there were any questions from the audience at this
There was
time.
one other, and it was about your college experience. And was it you're getting into the college, and did you enjoy being in an all Black, for example, milieu, and getting through college? something about your college experiences.
Okay. Well, my brother Ken influenced me in two major ways in my life. One, he went to Clark College for 2 years, and he suggested that he thought Morehouse would be a better fit for me, which was right across the street. I only applied to Morehouse, one college. Tuskegee, I had interest, but I don't think I ever mailed in my application. So I was very fortunate to get in college or to get accepted at Morehouse because I didn't have a plan B. Um, and in the book I talk about the college experience, and I talk about being around Black folks from all over the country with different backgrounds, and the fact that most of the students that came to Morehouse and or come to Morehouse tend to be the top 10%, 5%. Some come at 15 years old because they're out of their junior year, sophomore year in high school. So I remember my freshman year, my roommate was one guy from Bob Jones. He was from McKeesport, and he's a freshman, and he had written articles for Playboy magazine. And then the other roommate I had was Ron Lundy, who's Dr. Lundy now, and he was early admit. He was there at 15. And then there was Merritt. And I said, well, fortunately, I was in the room with these two guys because they really were very helpful to me in making it through my freshman year. But it was, probably, one of the highlights of my life was, being in Atlanta with all that was going on with H. Rap Brown. Julian Bond was running for office my freshman year in college. There were Spelman College, which over 1,000 females from across the country with various interests, fraternity life. My first 2 years, I worked really hard in my studies. And then I didn't work quite as hard as my junior year and senior year. I had a lot more fun, but not to the extent of being in jeopardy of not finishing college because my folks would have killed me.
So when you came here, did you finish college when you came to Seattle?
I had finished, yeah. I had finished that May, and I think I came in July.
Okay.
And then I went to Seattle University for grad school, a master's in education.
And how different was Seattle U versus Morehouse in 1970?
Well, the thing that I like about Seattle U was the first time I walked on the University of Washington campus, I was out for an interview in that area, and I had never been on the campus. And when I walked into the middle of the heart of the campus, it scared me to death. It was so huge. I'd never seen a university that big before. So Seattle University, I liked. It was smaller. You got to know those teachers and instructors, although I was working and going to school at night. So I didn't have the kind of experience I had at Morehouse in terms of getting to know my colleagues and classmates to the degree that ordinarily I would probably if I was going during the day. But it was a good experience.
Thank you. Jill?
We don't have any
Merritt
more.
and I are
Go ahead.
okay.
You go
So
ahead.
Merritt, I just wanted to give you a chance to give some closing arguments about your experience in writing this book.
I'm sorry, Gloria, could you repeat that, please?
I'd like to give you an opportunity to give us some closing comment about your experience.
Oh, okay. Good question, Gloria. One, going into writing the book, I always fashioned myself as being someone that was really shaped and influenced by my mother. And I was, but after writing the book, I realized that my father's influence on me was greater than I had imagined. Just from the experiences and going through the process of writing. Um, and then I think about the section that I read earlier about my father's muckers. And when I was a kid, a young kid, he'd put his muckers in the bathtub and wash them up. And it was just such an interesting name to me. And then X years after being in the Northwest, and I go, muckers, muck, mire. It all made sense that that's what he was talking about, the muck and the mire, the dirt. But muckers was like it was a instrument or a type of clothing you could go to the grocery store or clothing store and buy, but it was something that I'm sure he'd heard from others who did work that caused them to be very dirty in the process. And why would you continue to wear nice, clean things every day when you know you're going to get dirty like you did the day before? So some things like that become clear. And also really appreciating the the vision that my folks, especially my mother, had for Ken and I. The question for us was not whether or not we were going to college. The question was, where were we going? Because they had made that decision and they were willing to do whatever they needed to do work-wise to make that happen. Uh, and they didn't have that experience. They didn't have role models, but they had learned from their experiences and living and what they thought we should have. And like all of us, you know, we want our kids to, you know, have things that we didn't have and to have a life that's better or more profitable or more enjoyable, however you want to define profitable, a life. As opposed to taking that so much for granted. And then I was interesting today as I was looking at the Enlightened flyer, hope and resiliency. And when I think about my experience and my writing of the book, it's more about resilience and resiliency than hope to me. Because it seems like, well, you got to get up again. Well, you got to climb that other hill. It's like, well, the rules been changed. Or you get in the room to change the rules or make the rules yourself. So those are things, Gloria, that come to my mind.
Thank you. Well, for my part, I would love to thank Enlightened Kitsap for allowing Merritt and me to give this presentation to our friends and families in Kitsap County. I grew up in Kitsap County. It's very close to my home heart. And we do in hope that you enjoyed this conversation. The book is available at Amazon.com and it's $23. And I believe that upon request, you would be able to get an autograph some kind of way. It would be available for you if you chose to purchase that book. And one other thing I wanted to just share with this group. Oh, excuse me, Merritt.
No, go ahead. I'm fine.
Oh, I thought you said something. One thing I wanted to share with this group is back in 1972 or something like that, Merritt and his brother Ken and their family came over to the Colvin's house for a barbecue. And we were in the family room talking, chatting about Bama. And they, Merritt and his in-law Jacqueline mentioned a teacher named Daisy Chapman, which you briefly Merritt referred to earlier. Well, my mother, being from Alabama, she punches her head out of the kitchen and she says, "That's my cousin." So even though we are worlds away in the Pacific Northwest, that world is really not that big now, is it?
No,
And
no.
Mom was so delighted to have somebody in her home from Alabama that day. Yeah.
Well, thank you
So,
very,
thank
very
you,
much.
Jill.
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Merritt, for such a lovely presentation. And I'm going to mention again that the way to order the books is on the Enlighten website. And also you can communicate with the library to request that the library get that book.
Yeah.
I'm going to thank you. We're going to
Okay.
wrap it up now.
Okay, and I wanted to just do a couple of quick thank yous as well. First, starting with Gloria. Gloria, I appreciate the fact that you thought about this early on and have worked with all your friends and colleagues in Kitsap with Enlighten to make this happen today. And Barbara and Lynn and Jill, I really appreciate you. And then, of course, Jose and Priya, thank you for your technical work and making sure that we had the pictures and the sound and everything else we needed to do this, because without that, it would have been impossible. So thanks all of you. It's been a real team effort. And thank you, Marcia, to down along as well.
Good. I think maybe we'll close it by doing our thank yous like this again, clapping, because if it were in person, we'd be clapping very loudly. So thank you again. And I think this will wrap it up.
All righty. Thank you.
Thank you.